Imagine you are halfway through making dinner. The broth is simmering, the kitchen already smells warm and familiar, and then you realize the pot needs something. Maybe a few celery stalks, maybe a handful of sturdy greens, maybe a mild onion flavor, or one bright leaf that keeps the whole soup from tasting heavy. Normally, you open the refrigerator and hope you bought enough. But imagine stepping outside with a pair of scissors instead. A few containers sit only a few steps from the kitchen, and each one is growing a different ingredient for the pot. That is the idea behind a container soup garden. It does not need a raised bed, a large backyard, or rows of perfect vegetables. It can be a group of pots on a patio, a sunny corner beside a back door, or a balcony where every square foot needs to earn its place. The important part is not how many containers you own. The important part is giving every container a job. One pot can provide aromatic stalks. Another can hold thick leaves that stay useful in a long-cooked stew. A smaller one may carry an herb-like green with such a strong personality that you only need a handful. And the surprising part is that choosing the plants is only half the work. How you water them, how much room you give them, and especially how you harvest them, can determine whether this little garden stays useful or slowly runs out of energy. So we are going to build this soup garden one container at a time, with 14 leafy and stem vegetables that can make everyday cooking more interesting. Some are familiar, a few are often overlooked, and one of the most obvious soup vegetables is also one of the easiest to disappoint in a pot. Before the first seedling goes into a pot, it helps to simplify the system. 14 crops do not require 14 completely different soil recipes. Start with a reliable container mix that drains well, holds some moisture, and does not collapse into a heavy block after repeated watering. Containers must have drainage openings, and the mix should be loose enough that water can move through the root zone instead of pooling around the base. From there, the adjustments are mostly about the plant. Large leafy crops use water differently from narrow onion crops. A head-forming vegetable needs different spacing from greens harvested young. A deep-rooted, moisture-sensitive crop deserves more root volume than a small aromatic plant. This is good news for a beginner because it means the garden can share one basic foundation while the containers are managed according to their jobs. Sunlight matters too, but do not turn the whole project into a hunt for perfect conditions. Most of these vegetables appreciate several hours of useful light, and many cool season greens perform best when intense summer heat is not pushing them beyond their preferred season. Watch the actual corner where you plan to grow. Morning sun and some afternoon relief can behave very differently from reflected heat on a west-facing wall. The container tells you what the plant experiences, how fast it dries, how warm the root zone becomes, and how quickly the leaves wilt at the hottest part of the day. That observation will be more useful than memorizing one rule for every climate in the country. That first container belongs to celery. Celery seems simple because we all recognize it. We know what the stalks look like. We know how often they appear in stocks, soups, stews, and slow-cooked dishes. But a celery plant growing in a container tells you very quickly whether the root zone has been treated consistently. The problem is usually not that the gardener forgot to water once. The bigger problem is the repeated swing between very dry and suddenly very wet. A shallow decorative pot can dry surprisingly fast on a bright patio. The top layer of mix turns pale, the leaves still look fairly green, and it is easy to give the plant a small drink. Then, the same thing happens again the next day. Celery may survive that pattern, but surviving and producing tender, useful stalks are not the same goal. A better starting point is a container around 12 inches deep or more, filled with a good container mix that drains reliably, but does not turn bone dry in a few hours. The exact watering schedule will change with the weather, the pot material, and the size of the plant. That is why I would rather check the moisture in the root zone than water celery by the calendar. On a hot, windy day, a container may need attention sooner. On a cool, cloudy day, the same pot may hold moisture much longer. And this is where the container can fool you. The surface may look dry, while the lower mix is still damp. Or the surface may look fine, while the root ball is drying faster than you expect. Push a finger into the mix, lift a smaller container if you can, and learn how the pot feels after a deep watering compared with a dry day.
The
You are not
easiest way
trying
to
to keep
tell
the
if your
roots
plant
sitting in
needs
stagnant
water is to simply
You are
lift the
trying to
pot
avoid
and feel the
dramatic
weight.
moisture swings. Celery also rewards steady feeding more than sudden rescue attempts. A plant making new stalks over a long period is using nutrients continuously, but that does not mean pouring in a strong fertilizer every time the leaves look pale. Start with a balanced container system, then feed lightly according to the product you use and the pace of growth. If the plant is sitting in cold, wet mix or struggling with damaged roots, more fertilizer will not solve the underlying problem. Pay attention to the leaves as well as the stalks. Pale growth, weak new leaves, or a plant that suddenly stops expanding are all reasons to slow down and investigate. Check moisture first. Check drainage. Look for aphids tucked into new growth. Container gardening gives you the advantage of being close enough to inspect the plant before a small problem becomes a season-long disappointment. And when you harvest celery, use a clean cut. Do
So
not
you want
wrench
to
an outer
gently
stalk
part
sideways
the
so
leaves
hard
like
that you
this
tear into
to
the
check
base
the
of the
new
plant.
growth right
A
at the
neat
center.
harvest reduces
To
unnecessary
harvest,
damage
simply
and
take a
makes it
sharp
easier to
knife
see what
and
remains.
slice the outer
When
stalks
celery
at the
is growing
base,
strongly,
just like
the
this.
outer stalks become one of the most practical harvests in this entire garden. You do not always need to pull the whole plant the first time you need celery for dinner. If the plant is mature enough and actively growing, you can take a few outer stalks, leave the center intact, and let the container continue doing its job. This is not a promise of endless celery. It is simply a way to match the harvest to the kitchen. And that matters, because a useful harvest is often much smaller than a dramatic harvest. 2 or 3 stalks, a few leaves, and the right timing can be more valuable on a Tuesday evening than a huge basket you do not know how to use. Now, look at the next container. From across the patio, the leaves may look even more impressive than celery. Tall, upright, green, and healthy. But this plant teaches the opposite lesson. The top can look wonderful while the part you really want is still disappointing. This is the leek. Leeks are excellent for a soup garden because they bring a mild, savory onion character without dominating every dish. But when we grow them in containers, it is easy to watch the green leaves and assume everything below is developing exactly as we hope. Then we look near the soil line and find a base that is thinner than expected. A leek needs more than green leaves. It needs enough root space, stable growth, and room around the plant to develop. Young leeks look narrow, so there is a temptation to crowd a lot of them together. At first, the container looks efficient. Later, the plants begin competing for the same small volume of moisture and nutrients. The green tops may still rise, but the edible base is telling a different story. This is why the empty space you see early is not always wasted space. It can be development space. In a soup garden, we are not trying to fit the largest possible number of plants into a photograph. We are trying to grow the parts we actually want to cook. As the leek grows, some gardeners gently add mix or hill around the lower portion to help create a longer pale section. The key word is gently. We do not bury the whole plant suddenly or pack wet material tightly around it. We simply support the lower stem as the plant develops, while keeping drainage and airflow in mind. The best visual check is to lower your attention. Do not only admire the leaves from above. Look near the soil line. Look at spacing. Look at the thickness of the base. The leaves tell you the plant is alive. The base tells you whether your container strategy is working. With celery and leeks, the soup garden now has aroma and savory depth, but it is still missing the kind of leaf that can turn a light broth into a meal. That is where the first heavy leafy container earns its space. Collard greens are built for a different job. The leaves are broad, sturdy, and substantial. In soups and stews, they can handle longer cooking better than very delicate greens. And in a container, they teach one of the most important lessons in this entire video. You do not always have to wait for a plant to look finished before you start using it. Many new gardeners watch a collard plant grow and keep waiting. They want the plant to become large, full, and complete. Then, one day, it finally looks impressive, and they celebrate by cutting almost everything they can reach. The plant goes from full to stripped in a few minutes. There is another way to think about it. When the plant is established and growing well, pay attention to the mature outer leaves. These are often the first leaves you can harvest for cooking while leaving the younger center growth in place. The goal is not to follow a rigid number of leaves. The goal is to look at the structure of the plant and protect the active center that is still producing new foliage. This is where harvesting becomes part of plant care. Take a leaf from the outside. Look at what remains. Is the center still strong? Does the plant still have enough leaf area to capture light and keep growing? If the answer is yes, you are working with the plant rather than simply removing from it. Collards also show why container moisture matters, even when a crop is tougher than celery. A big leafy plant can move a surprising amount of water on a warm day. A pot that felt comfortably moist when the plant was small may dry much faster once those broad leaves fill the space. The plant did not suddenly become difficult, the plant simply became larger. And that change in demand is something we need to notice throughout the season. Collards are also a good example of why lower leaves deserve attention before the entire plant looks sick. Older leaves may yellow naturally over time, but yellowing can also tell you that the plant is stressed, crowded, or struggling with moisture. Do not automatically respond with more fertilizer. Look for the pattern. Is one old leaf fading, or is the whole plant losing color? Is the pot staying wet for days? Are roots packed tightly against the sides? Are caterpillars chewing holes faster than the plant can replace tissue? Brassica pests can turn a beautiful collard container into lace if you stop looking closely. Check the undersides of leaves. Look along the central veins. Small caterpillars and clusters of eggs are much easier to manage when you notice them early. Hand picking can be enough in a small patio garden, and the real advantage is that you can inspect a handful of pots in minutes. That inspection habit becomes part of the harvest routine.
When you find pests like this, it's best to gently remove them by hand and place them elsewhere so they don't destroy the harvest.
Check the new growth in the center. A 10-second glance
So I'm just
gives you
gently turning this leaf
pests,
over, see how the
moisture,
veins are
stress,
prominent.
and the plant's
We're
recovery
looking for
all
any
at once.
aphids hiding
Now,
underneath before
collards
we
reward
harvest.
patience and observation. The next green can punish late timing in a completely different way. Mustard greens earn their space because they bring a bolder flavor. They are not just another green leaf for adding bulk. They can add peppery depth and a sharper personality to soups, especially when you use them with richer ingredients. But the flavor and texture of mustard leaves can change as the plant ages and the weather warms. This is one of the reasons bigger is not automatically better. A gardener can look at a container full of mustard greens and think, just a few more days, just a little more size. But the leaf you wanted for dinner may be better before it becomes the biggest leaf in the pot. Taste a small piece. Notice the texture. Pay attention to the weather. If the plant is heading into hotter conditions, you may decide to harvest useful leaves sooner rather than chasing maximum size. Mustard can also move quickly from tender growth to flowering when conditions push it. A rising flower stalk is not a moral failure in the garden. It is simply the plant changing stages. Once that happens, flavor often becomes stronger and the leaves may be less appealing for the way you plan to cook them. The useful response is not panic. Harvest what still tastes good. Let one plant flower if you enjoy watching pollinators. Or clear the container
We're
and
just taking
replant
the
when the
bottom
season
ones
becomes
today to
favorable
let
again.
the top keep
A
growing for
working kitchen
seeds.
garden is allowed to change. Containers make that easier because one crop can leave and another can take its place without redesigning the whole patio. This flexibility is especially important in the United States, where a cool season crop may be thriving in one state, while the same crop is already struggling with heat in another. The calendar is only a starting point. Plant behavior is the final report. Mustard also reminds us that a soup garden should reflect the way we actually cook.
Look at the difference.
If your family likes
this one
mild
is
broths,
thriving,
one container
while this
may
poor
be enough.
guy is completely
If you enjoy
heat
stronger
stressed.
greens, you may want more. The number of plants should follow the kitchen, not the other way around. At this point, the patio is getting greener. We have upright stalks, thick leaves, and bold greens. But adding more leafy plants creates a new problem that is easy to miss from above. The problem is crowding. Kale is a perfect example because the mistake usually begins with good intentions. A young kale plant looks small. The container looks large. There is empty mix between plants, and that empty space makes an enthusiastic gardener uncomfortable. So, another seedling goes in, maybe one more after that. For a while the pot looks efficient, then the leaves expand. Now they overlap. Air moves less freely. The surface of the pot is shaded in some places and exposed in others. The root systems share the same limited volume. On a hot afternoon, the container can move from comfortable moisture to dry much faster than expected. And strangely, adding another plant can give you less of what you wanted. The empty space you see at planting time is not always wasted space. Sometimes it is future leaf space. Kale does not need a huge field to grow useful leaves, but the plant does need enough room to express its natural shape. In a container, that may mean fewer plants than your eyes want at the beginning. The reward is easier airflow, easier watering, and a clearer view of which leaves are mature enough to harvest. The same outer leaf logic can often be useful here when the plant is established. Take mature leaves, avoid damaging the central growing point, and let the plant show you how quickly it is replacing what you remove. If new growth is slowing, that is information. The plant may need more time, more consistent moisture, or a lighter harvest. Now look beside the kale, and the garden changes color and texture. Swiss chard is almost designed for this video because both the leaves and the thick stems are useful, but they do not always belong in the cooking pot at exactly the same moment. The leaf blade is softer, the stalk is thicker and more substantial. If you chop everything together and add it all to a soup at once, the leaves may soften before the stems reach the texture you want. A simple kitchen adjustment is to separate them. Chop the thicker stems and give them a head start. Add the leaves later. That tiny cooking detail changes the way you look at the plant outside. Now, the stem is not waste. It is not just the part holding the leaf up. It is part of the harvest. Chard can also become a large, thirsty container plant as the weather warms. The more leaves you keep, the more the plant is actively moving water. Again, the lesson is not to water by a fixed schedule. Watch the pot, watch the plant. A container garden is small enough that you can notice changes quickly, and that is one of its greatest advantages. But this is also the point where the garden starts looking its most productive. Leaves overlap, colors deepen, the containers finally look full. And that is exactly when the scissors can become the biggest problem in the entire system. Before we add another plant, we need to talk about a harvesting mistake that can quietly weaken almost every leafy container here. The mistake is assuming that a full plant is a plant we can strip heavily. It is tempting. You have waited. The leaves look good. You are proud of the container. So, you take a large harvest all at once. On some crops, at some stages, a heavy harvest may be part of the plan. But if your goal is to keep a plant useful for repeated cutting, removing too much active leaf area can slow the plant down more than you expect. Leaves are not simply the product. They are part of the plant's working system. They capture light. They help power new growth. They support the roots that support the next leaves you want to harvest. When we remove foliage, we are asking the plant to rebuild. The question is how much working capacity we leave behind. And there is another problem. Not all leafy vegetables have the same structure. A collard plant with broad outer leaves and a visible center is not built exactly like bok choy. Bok choy is not built like a heading cabbage. Green onions are different again. If we carry one harvesting rule from container to container, the scissors become a blunt tool. So pause before you cut. Where is the active growing point? What part of the plant are you actually growing for? Are you taking a few mature leaves, a whole young plant, a stalk, a bulb, or a root crop with edible tops? And after the harvest, what does the plant still have left? Harvesting is not the moment when plant care stops. In a container garden, harvesting is part of plant care. There is one more reason over-harvesting becomes tempting in a container garden. Everything is visible. In a large bed, you may take a few leaves and walk away. On a patio, the entire crop is right in front of you. The scissors are in your hand. The basket is still half empty, so you keep cutting. Try reversing the question. Instead of asking, "How much can I harvest today?" ask, "How much do I need for this meal?" That simple change protects the plants and reduces waste in the kitchen. It also turns the garden into a habit. You return tomorrow, or in several days, and look again. You notice which plant replaced leaves quickly and which one needs more time. You learn the rhythm of each crop. This is the point where a container soup garden begins to feel less like a collection and more like a system. The plants are not all harvested on one dramatic day. They enter the kitchen in small waves. That lesson becomes immediately useful with the next plant, because what looks like a simple bundle of leaves is actually a very different structure from collards or kale. This is bok choy. Bok choy brings tender leaves and crisp, juicy stems to brothy soups. It also fits beautifully into a container garden because many varieties stay relatively compact. But compact does not mean indestructible, and it does not mean every plant should be harvested like a collard. Look at the structure. The stems gather closely around the center. The leaves rise from a tighter base. Depending on the variety, the stage of growth, and the way you want to use it, you may harvest young whole plants, or take selected outer portions carefully. What you should not do is assume that every bok choy will respond to aggressive, repeated cutting exactly the same way as a large leafy green with a more open growth habit. This is where the purpose of the crop matters. If you want baby bok choy for soup, you may sow more closely and harvest young plants. If you want larger heads with thicker stems, the plants need more room. Same species, different kitchen goal, different container strategy. And in the kitchen, the stems again deserve attention. They often need a little more time than the soft leaves. Add the chopped stem portions first, then add the leafy sections later if you want to preserve more texture. Bok choy also makes crowding very easy to underestimate. Young seedlings are tiny. A tray of them looks harmless. But once those stems begin to widen, the center of a crowded pot can stay damp and still have poor airflow. Space is not only for roots, it is also for the leaves and stems you hope to harvest. Bok choy is also worth watching closely for insect damage. The broad, tender leaves are attractive to several common brassica pests, and damage can appear quickly on a young plant. Again, a small garden gives you an advantage. Turn the leaves over. Check the center where new growth is tightly packed. Remove badly damaged leaves only when necessary, and avoid stripping a young plant just because one leaf has holes. Water at the root zone when practical, rather than repeatedly soaking the crown late in the day. Good airflow and sensible spacing cannot prevent every disease problem, but they make the container easier to manage and easier to inspect. And remember the cooking goal. If you want crisp, white or pale green stems in a light broth, harvest before the plant becomes old and coarse. A plant can still be alive and growing while moving past the stage you enjoy most in the kitchen. The next container makes the purpose question even more obvious. Napa cabbage is leafy, but if you are growing it for a developed head, you cannot treat it like a loose patch of cut-and-come-again greens. A head needs room to form. The plant needs time. The leaves need space to fold and build structure. This is a good place to ask a simple question before planting any vegetable. What part am I actually trying to harvest? With Napa cabbage, maybe you want young leaves and smaller plants for light soups. That can be a valid goal. Or maybe you want a more developed head for brothy dishes, stews, or other meals. That is a different goal. The container should follow the goal. A plant grown for a larger head should not be squeezed between several other hungry plants just because the pot looked empty on planting day. Give it enough root room. Keep moisture steady. Watch for heat, because very warm conditions can push cool season brassicas away from the quality you hoped for. Napa cabbage also teaches patience with feeding. When gardeners see slow head development, the first instinct is often to add more fertilizer. But a plant cannot build a good head if it is crowded, heat-stressed, or repeatedly drying out. Nutrients are only one part of the system. Look at the entire container. Does water run straight down the sides? because the mix has pulled away from the pot? Is the plant leaning because several neighbors are pressing against it? Are the outer leaves damaged by slugs or caterpillars? Is the weather simply too warm for the quality you want? A useful gardener learns to diagnose before adding. More water, more fertilizer, and more plants are not automatically more productive. Sometimes, the best improvement is removing one competitor, watering deeply, and giving the plant time. And when you harvest, treat the plant according to the outcome you chose from the beginning. Now, the soup garden has plenty of leaves, but a pot of soup often begins before the greens ever go in. It begins with aroma. That is why the next two containers may not look as dramatic from across the patio, but they can shape the direction of a dish. The first is green onion. Green onions are one of the easiest crops to underestimate because they do not produce the giant leaves or broad canopies that dominate a thumbnail. But in a small kitchen garden, their narrow footprint is part of the advantage. A few plants can fit into a modest container. You can keep them near the kitchen. When a soup needs a mild onion note, a fresh garnish, or an aromatic base, you do not need a basket. You need a few stalks. And this is where a useful harvest becomes more important than a large harvest. With green onions, the harvest strategy depends on how you are growing them. Some gardeners pull whole young plants. Others take a portion and leave some plants to continue developing. What matters is avoiding the idea that every container has to produce a giant one-day harvest to justify its space. A pot that gives you 3 useful green onions at the exact moment you need them has done its job. It also gives us a nice break from the big leafy containers. The roots are shallower than the needs of larger crops, the foliage is narrow, and the plant can fit into spaces that would not be enough for a mature kale or chard plant. In a thoughtful layout, small aromatic crops can occupy the edges of the soup garden without competing for the same visual space as the larger greens. But the next aromatic plant is different. It has a much stronger personality, and not everyone wants it in every soup. Fennel. Fennel deserves an honest introduction because it is not a universal flavor. Some people love the sweet, anise-like aroma. Others do not. And that is exactly why it belongs in this discussion. A useful kitchen garden should reflect your cooking, not a generic list of plants someone told you to grow. If you grow Florence fennel for the swollen bulb, give it room. Do not assume a tiny pot packed with several plants will produce the same structure you see at a market. The bulb needs space to develop, and the plant does not appreciate repeated stress from drying and overcrowding. The fronds are useful too. They carry aroma and can be harvested in smaller amounts. Again, this is not a crop you need to dump into every soup. It is a crop you learn. Smell the fronds. Taste a little. Think about the dishes you actually make. A light broth with fish may use fennel very differently from a beef stew. The plant earns its space when you understand where it belongs. And this is where the soup garden becomes more interesting. The first plants gave us familiar structure and familiar flavors. Now we can add containers that do not need to produce a large bowl of greens to be valuable. The next plant proves that with one small handful. Sorrel. Sorrel can bring a bright, tangy character that surprises people who expect every leafy green to taste mild or earthy. Depending on the type and the leaf, the flavor can feel lemony or sharply fresh. That makes it useful in soups that need brightness. But because the flavor is distinctive, more is not always better. This is a plant I would taste before harvesting heavily. Pick one clean leaf, taste a small piece, learn the strength of the plant you are growing. Then decide how much belongs in the pot. A few leaves may be enough to wake up a soup that feels flat. A huge bowl may push the dish in a direction you did not want. Sorrel is a wonderful example of why a small container can still be valuable. The plant does not need to dominate the patio. It can sit in its own pot, where you can control the harvest and take a handful at a time. And the harvesting lesson returns again. Take useful leaves, watch the center, and allow the plant time to recover between heavier cuts. If the leaves are becoming tougher or the plant is stressed by heat, adjust your expectations. The garden is not a factory. It is a group of living plants responding to weather, water, and the way we use them. Sorrel changes the cooking pot with flavor. The next green changes the garden first with appearance, and then surprises you in the kitchen. Orach is less familiar to many container gardeners. Depending on the variety, the leaves may be green, red, or deep purple, and that color can make one container stand out among a group of ordinary greens. But color alone is not a reason to give a plant space in a working soup garden. The reason to consider Orach is that the younger leaves can be used as a leafy green, giving you another option when you want variety. It has a different presence from collards, mustard, or kale, and that variety matters over a long season. A garden can become boring even when it is productive if every container gives you the same texture and flavor. Orach also reminds us to learn each plant before we make big harvest decisions. Use younger leaves. Watch how the plant responds to heat in your climate. Keep the container from drying to the point of repeated stress. And if the plant starts racing upward, pay attention to the stage of growth rather than assuming you should wait forever for bigger leaves. By now we have stalks, thick greens, tender greens, aromatic plants, and a few stronger flavors. But the final two plants reveal one last trick. Sometimes you are already growing soup greens without thinking of them as soup crops at all. Look above the soil in a container of turnips. Many gardeners look at turnip foliage and think only about what is happening underground. The leaves are treated as a signal. Healthy tops, hopefully healthy roots. But turnip greens have their own place in hearty soups and stews. The important question is why you planted the turnips. If your main goal is the root, the leaves are part of the system feeding that root. Removing too much foliage can work against your original goal. This is where the harvesting lesson from the middle of the video becomes practical again. Take selectively. Do not strip the entire plant. Choose a few useful leaves from healthy plants and leave enough foliage to support continued root development. If, on the other hand, you are growing primarily for greens, your spacing, timing, and harvest strategy can be different. The same crop can serve two kitchen goals, but the plant cannot always maximize both at the same time. That is a useful truth far beyond turnips. Every container needs a job, and the clearer the job is, the easier your decisions become. The last plant brings the same idea into an even more familiar root crop. Beet. A lot of people grow beets and spend weeks staring at the soil line, waiting to see the root shoulder swell. The leaves are almost background scenery, but beet greens are edible and useful. The leaves can be cooked much like other tender greens, and the stems can add texture. Younger leaves are often more tender, while larger leaves may need a little more cooking. Again, the goal matters. If you want good beetroot development, do not celebrate the edible leaves by cutting away the whole canopy. The plant needs foliage. Take a small, selective harvest from vigorous plants and leave plenty behind. This is not about squeezing every possible edible gram from a container. It is about noticing what the plant is already offering. Sometimes the garden gives you an ingredient before the crop you originally planted is ready. And now, with all 14 plants in view, there is one question left. What actually makes this a soup garden, instead of just another crowded patio full of pots? The answer is not the number 14. You do not need celery, leeks, collards, mustard greens, kale, Swiss chard, bok choy, Napa cabbage, green onions, fennel, sorrel, orach, turnip greens, and beet greens all at the same time. The answer is purpose. Celery and leeks can build aroma. Collards and kale can add hearty leaf texture. Mustard brings boldness. Chard gives you both leaves and substantial stems. Bok choy and Napa cabbage bring softer, brothy textures. Green onions and fennel shape aroma in completely different directions. Sorrel adds brightness. Orach adds variety. Turnip and beet leaves remind you to look at the whole plant. Every container has a job. And once you start thinking that way, the garden becomes easier to plan. Look at the soups and stews you actually cook. What do you buy again and again? What do you only need in small amounts? Which greens disappear quickly in your refrigerator? Which flavors do you enjoy enough to use every week? Start there. Maybe your first soup garden is only 3 pots. A deep container for celery, a sturdy pot for collards or chard, a small container of green onions near the kitchen door. That is enough. As you learn how those plants grow in your light, your weather, and your watering routine, add another. Maybe leeks, maybe sorrel, maybe bok choy in the cool season. Let the garden follow your meals. And keep watching the harvest. Do not wait so long that every leaf becomes older than the texture you enjoy. Do not cut so hard that the plant loses the working foliage it needs to recover. Do not water every container by the same calendar. A crowded kale pot, a deep celery container, and a small pot of green onions may all dry at different rates on the same day. Walk through the garden. Look low on the leeks. Look into the center of the collards. Touch the mix around the celery. Notice whether the charred stems are thickening. Watch the bok choy base. Taste one sorrel leaf before you take a handful. The advantage of a container garden is that everything is close enough to observe. And that brings us back to the kitchen. The soup is simmering. You realize it needs something fresh. This time, you do not search the refrigerator first. You step outside. You look at the containers, not as 14 separate plants, but as 14 possible ingredients. You cut only what you need. A celery stalk, a few chard stems, 2 collard leaves, a green onion, maybe 1 or 2 sorrel leaves for brightness. You carry a small bowl back inside. It does not look like a farm harvest. It does not need to. For tonight's dinner, it is exactly enough. A useful container garden is not defined by how many plants you can squeeze into a small space. It becomes useful when every pot has a purpose, when you understand what part of the plant you are growing for, and when your harvesting leaves enough life behind for the garden to keep moving. The real soup garden begins the first evening you step outside, cut what you need, and realize that dinner has been growing a few steps from your kitchen.